Welcome to episode 9 of the Radical Narrative Podcast. I am your host, Milan Tatusis, coming at you from Treaty 6 territory, smack dab in the middle of the prairie. Today on the episode, I'm sitting down with Hal Cameron. Hal Cameron is from Beardy's and Okimâsis First Nation. He has a passion for creating spaces where Nêhiyawêwin, the Cree language and the Y dialect, can exist in daily life. He works to encourage learners to break through barriers and to promote the beauty of our indigenous languages through art. The amazing thing with Hal is that he actually actively learned the language to be able to speak it to a level of fluency and proficiency within 4 years. And he's going to speak about how Nêhiyawêwin, the Plains Cree Y dialect, provides the ability to connect to land, culture, history, ancestors all at once, all at the same time. In this episode, he gives a lot of advice to language learners out there wanting to reignite and reclaim our indigenous languages. And of course, this is all coming from the perspective of Nêhiyawêwin, the Plains Cree Y dialect. Listen in as we talk about methods of learning and how he learned, cutting out the English language completely, including books and Netflix, and how building relationships with other international indigenous people often yields really cool outcomes and motivations. So stay tuned and listen in. So yeah, when we had conversations in the past, and I remember visiting with you on campus one time, going for dinner and talking story and things like that. And then in that short span of time we didn't see each other, you all of a sudden you became really fluent in Cree. And I know people say they're never really fluent in a language, but you demonstrated this ability to learn the language on the fly and be able to converse. And you're conversing with, people of all ages and who speak our language fluently. And that was really cool to see. So I said, yeah, when I do a podcast, I want to get Hal on there to speak to this because he did it. He's one of the ones who picked up the language again and learned it.
Yeah, I'm like those other people who say that they're not fluent. I don't consider myself a fluent speaker because there's just still so much to learn. I still have trouble trying to express my own thoughts in the language. It's way easier to understand when people are speaking, when they tell stories, and it's really easy to pick up on what they're saying and even the context of who they're speaking of or when they're talking and when they're speaking of in terms of timeline, things like that. And I still got a long ways to go, but I know I have a really good little foundation going already. So
yeah, you got a really strong foundation going. But first and foremost, tell us about yourself. Tell us about who you are, where you come from. And you could do that in Nêhiyawêwin. You could do that in our Cree language so our listeners hear what we're talking about.
How get the Dumskaten and Okimâgan Hal Cameron see Gashvan Equa Ni Kupawin in Coche Howard Cameron Kagiti Tequa Norlane Southern Ninigi Quack Nist no Pego Sapaski Tato Pipunian Mequats in English, I guess. I greeted you, my relative. My name is Hal Cameron. I am from in English, they know it as Beardy's and Okimâsis. But in Cree, Nipsiko Pawini Nak, it talks about where the Willow Cree people reside, and that's what we refer to ourselves as. My parents are the late Howard Cameron, and my mom is Norlane Sutherland, or Norlane Grey Eyes now, and I am 31 years old at the moment. Those are the kind of things I introduced myself as.
Yeah, and we'll talk about it later, but one of the cool things with our language, Nêhiyawêwin, is that our place names are really cool. Like, they're badass when you actually start to unpack it.
Yeah. There's so much in even how I described as a Nipsikupawiinu, as a Willow Cree person. Even in that word, there's lots of the morphology of how the word fits and how descriptive it is. It's pretty neat.
Yeah, awesome. And what do you do?
That's a good question. I guess by day, I work at our health center, and I'm kind of like the cultural resource support worker. So I just help try and incorporate more as much cultural awareness into our center, I connect, well, we have elders, we connect them with the different departments to try and, I guess, strengthen that base as holistic health. So by day, I do that. By night, I don't know, I like doing art. I like, trying to learn the language. Lots of reading, lots of just simple life like that, I guess, yeah.
Yeah. Well, you say it's a simple life, but it's really cool that you're working in the community and you're positioning yourself in that space there.
Yeah. It's like it wasn't intentional. It's kind of just the way things unfolded, which is kind of neat to think about. Like I just pursued this the life that I'm leading right now, and not so much of trying to create it to expect anything in return, but by just doing so and living the life, things kind of just fall into place, and it's led me to where I am, and I don't know, I'm got to be grateful for it.
Yeah, and I guess being in that space and place of your home community allowed you to learn this language.
Yeah, I'm pretty fortunate to be able to, because I know a lot of people, just in the kind of world we live in or the system we're in, it's kind of being taught that you have to go out to your community and learn, or go to school and all this stuff, and then you're taken away from that aspect, and then so a lot of people are, I don't want to say displaced, but like, away from home, and they don't really get the opportunity to focus on things like language because they're in the city centers. There's some, but not as much. And so by being able to be at home, work at home, and just be surrounded by really good speakers has made it the task or the adventure as a language learner that much. It's made it easier, I guess.
So tell our audience who may not be familiar with our Cree language, Nêhiyawêwin, tell us about the language and specifically what dialect you speak.
In Nêhiyawêwin, we speak the Y dialect where we're situated. I guess where we are located, like I want to say, as Willow Cree people in between Saskatoon, Prince Albert. We're kind of like on the edge of the boreal forest, or the Nisbet forest. I don't remember the termination, but and so it makes us plains, but also at the same time we're not, and we're also situated by like Duck Lake and Fort Carlton area, so there's a lot of like the history of like the Métis history, so there's a lot of that history in our community as well. But in terms of the language, I feel it's very descriptive and kind of like a spiritual language in the sense of how tied it is into not just as a mode of communication between physical beings, but more so like in a bigger, broader sense. It like connects you to land, it connects you to ancestors and all those things that you hear of when people are speaking or praying in the language. You hear them speaking to those things like they're there and present and connected all at that exact moment. I don't know, it's really big to go into, but it's like, and it's simply put, that's the way that I feel the language, how it works, I guess.
Yeah, and I really wanted to position that in our conversation because you highlighted where you said like there's this dynamic now today where some people don't have access to their language, so they have to go out to learn it or to find it. And unfortunately, a lot of that is in like schools or even universities now with programs that are offering the language. But it's almost as if it's not the version that we could connect to in our home communities when there is a fluent speaker. It is positioned as like a spiritual language. Like my late father always said, it was a language of love and compassion, that it just embodied and imbued in the language.
I like the way that is put. Yeah, I can agree with that.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to position, was that you're in your community learning this language straight from the source. And it is unfortunate that, sometimes people have to go out and learn this language. But then at the same time, there's an irony there, and because our dialects and even how we speak regionally in our community is also very unique.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's like you have to almost be... yeah, I don't know if that part is like taught as much in terms of the different like the the way it's spoken in different regions of our territories. Because like Nêhiyawêwin, it's so vast. There's like covers so much ground. But yeah, when let's say someone who speaks woodland Cree who comes to Saskatoon and is taking a I don't know Cree 101 or whatever the class title is, and they'll be teaching it in Plains, and it's like yeah, it's I don't want to say it's a barrier, but it's also an extra shift that person has to do in order to I don't know. Just thinking about it would make it the process a little bit more challenging or a little bit yeah, and rather than us having the resources to be able to just directly ask those people who speak our language in our communities or in our regions, because I know that'd be difficult even in a school setting, whether it's post-sec or something. And I've also like noticed too, like when even in a like a Western educational system of learning, like universities and how it's being taught, or even in communities as well. I've noticed that it's hard to, because they're using like SRO, like standard Roman orthography, to teach the language. So you're at the same time you're thinking in English while learning Nêhiyawêwin, and it's like it really like messes with the mind trying to like unlearn that.
Yeah, that's really interesting you said that. I didn't even realize that until you said it, is that how we sort of teach Cree is by using standard Roman orthography, which is basically English words and English letters to teach that language. So it's like a clash of paradigms in the brain.
Yep.
Yeah. And that's what's cool about you, is that you got to learn this language and pick it up on your own terms in your own community. And we'll get to that and talk about that. But what I want to sort of highlight, and I wanted to highlight too that like even for me in my experience, my dynamic is that, you know, I had a fluent father in the Plains Cree language, and my uncles and aunties are fluent. But my household, you know, we were like a bilingual family in terms of English and Cree. My grandmother was Nakota, and she married into Norrie House, Manitoba. So even in that household, the family resorted to English to talk. And then at the same time, I even noticed that like in our communities, we accommodate English a lot. Like we accommodate English in terms of the written language, and we accommodate English in terms of teachers we bring in, and just in terms of like even governance conversations and stuff like that. And, you know, sometimes we even revert to English when somebody doesn't speak Cree, because for me there is a language gap, and I've always like looked critically at it and trying to figure this out. But in your eyes, in your perspective, why do you feel like there is a gap in this language fluency amongst our younger generation today?
Like I can empathize with like what you were just sharing, because like I obviously grew up similar, where like my late dad would speak fluent Cree, and then yeah, someone would come into the conversation. They may not even have been indigenous, and then they would just switch to English. I've been trying to unpack that, like I guess for myself for a long time, of why we seem to always like compromise our ability to just express ourselves, especially for a fluent speaker to be able to express themselves to the fullest. In the language, and not feel the need to have to translate it, or and yeah, it's maybe like throughout the history of like the residential schools and like that trauma when it comes to like having the language like physically beaten out of you, or like maybe it's that where we feel that it is above. I don't know. Maybe could be that little mental or subconscious thing that is still needing to be unlearned, but also the world that we exist in right now. It's just, to be quite honest, there's the space for the language is becoming more and more limited, and I think that is adding to the pressures or the tasks of those who are trying to do this language work and trying to revive it or trying to wake it up. It makes it more challenging for them, because the spaces that even our young people are wanting to be engaged in is more like Western dominated. So I think that's like where I feel is that the challenge in why the language fluency amongst younger generations is minimal.
Yeah. And I think, yeah, we're definitely having a good conversation that we don't have answers to, but I really want to have this conversation because there is a psychology there around language, and it is often tied to colonialism or shame or even not having access to physical space because of relocation or having to move somewhere. Yeah. And yeah, for me, there's really no answer, but it's amazing to hear your thoughts on it as somebody who made their way across that like bridge that gap and did achieve some form of comprehension in terms of our language and being able to embody it and speak it.
Yeah. I think it comes to this as a learner. Like for me, I don't feel like it was my choice to be a language learner, like to where I am. Like if I can remember just being a young kid and people would come over and visit my parents, and they would tell us to go and play. But then a couple times I would go and like sit underneath the table because the table was pushed against the wall. So I would like sneak under there, and I'd be sitting under there, and I would hear them all talking, and then I would be like wondering what is this language that they're speaking, and like that's like early on memories I have of them, me understanding that they're speaking in a different language. And then like I remember being young on my way home from, I think we were coming home from school or something, and my late dad was driving us, and one of the first words he would taught us, he was like miigwap, which is like a lodge or a teepee. And so like just have those like really like early memories of learning, and I think it's just like something that is a part of me that I'm supposed to do, which is, it's really like comforting.
Yeah.
Because the language is sacred, because it's a spiritual language, and it connects us to our ancestors, and it connects us to that realm, which is really good to feel as a language learner, because it is usually typically very lonely.
Yeah, I bet. And you even said yourself that, the world we're living in is like it is a Western world where everything's framed from English. It's structured to be English dominant. Like even like, people like how self-care today is even like taking time out to watch Netflix, which is all like English programming, right? Unless someone's watching like a foreign film. But it's really hard. It's getting, like you said, it's getting harder to access the spaces where our language is primary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a big challenge. Like it's, even for myself, who has like dedicated time, I would say daily, to be trying my best to think in the language. It's hard to do because there's so many things. You open up your phone, it's in English. You turn on the TV, turn on the radio. You open up your favorite book. Like you grab something to eat, the packaging, like, oh, it's everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm really glad we're having this conversation, because obviously there's people out there who are fluent, and even in the North, a lot of communities still maintain fluency. But I really wanted to have an open conversation about this for listeners who are struggling with what I'm struggling with, and like in the past, what you struggled with, and what you're talking about here with trying to make our language primary again and going about learning it. And of course we're talking in English, but I mean, I really wanted to have a conversation with you about this, because it was so cool to see your process in a couple of years, to be able to even show up in our community and visit, all my aunties and uncles and speaking Cree. And when I seen that, I was like, oh yeah, this guy's doing it. Like he's there. And I guess the question now is how long did it take you to learn what you know now? Or at least to like jump across that threshold to be able to hold conversations with anyone who's fluent?
Man, to put a timeline on it, that'd be tough. But I would say, because I have such an early memory of learning the language and like being able to pick up on it, and especially the sounds. Like I remember I was like able to like read and write in syllabics ever since like we were taught it in elementary school and middle school. And so even from there, I still remember words that like I don't think I've used since, but they're there. They're just like in that piece of me that it will never go away. so like I've been learning since then, but when I took a serious stance, I would say probably like 4 years ago is when I was like, okay, I know that this part of me of language learning is there. I tried to shut it off. I thought that almost like compromise my own morals and stuff and be like, okay, well, it's time to just exist in this world that is present and be like, oh, I'll go and try and make lots of money and blah, blah, blah. And then, but I couldn't. This piece kept reoccurring. And I was like, finally, I was like, fine, I'll give in. I'll listen to what you guys are saying, and from there, I was when I committed. I think internally, like that, things kind of started to fall into place. Like what I said earlier, where I stopped trying to control that and just let things kind of fall into place. And then I started to meet these people who were doing really good work or have done the work, or who were really good support systems. And then that started to make it easier because then I started to pick up on some of the methods and tools that were being used. And so once I started to do that, I got that little foundation of how I wanted to learn and how to be a learner. Then I just started putting things into practice every day, and especially through stories. We're such like an oral people, and especially like through oral traditions and passed down Nêhiyawêwin. I think that's how you say it, like those sacred stories. So to be able to learn from my language helpers by them telling me stories, me listening to it, and then just hearing the story over and over again until it, like the words started to make sense, and then me practicing those words and practicing sharing and telling those same stories really helped me because I was starting to actually use the language. And then I started to come up with my own stories. And with the help of my language helpers, they helped me fine tune it in terms of thinking in Cree.
Yeah, thinking in Cree. Can you explain what that means to think in Cree and to tell these stories from a Cree perspective within your mind while you're embodying the language? Because it's drastically different than telling them in English.
So when you're telling a story in English and then you try to tell it in the language in Nêhiyawêwin, it doesn't transition over the same. There's like it's a different way of thinking, different way of expressing yourself. So a lot of the translation gets lost even if you try to translate a story in the language into English. A lot of it gets watered down, I'd like to say, because English is, I like to say it's watered down.
Yeah.
And as my language journey, I would say 4 years.
And after that 4 years, when was the moment for you when you feel like you actually bridged the gap, or at least got a sense or knowing that you walked across the line into the language and being able to obtain some sort of fluency and mind with that?
And I remember it really clearly is when I was in a kind of like a little language workshop. We brought in a couple people to help us, and there was a group of us young people, and we paired up with some elders, and we were making up stories on the fly. So we had our language helper sit there, and we had this little piece of felt and all the little things. There's like a tree, a house, there's a rabbit, there's all these little things, and we were like asking my auntie to tell us a story, and she was like having fun with it and being vulnerable with us, and she was like making these funny little stories. And I remember one of the instructors, or the person leading, asked us in the language a question about what was happening, and I responded really quickly back in the language the answer to his question, and it was like a light bulb went, or it was like I was existing in this other form of like vibration of me. It was like, I don't know, it was really I don't even know the word for it. But it was like a light bulb, and it really clicked, and then from there I think it just kind of picked up on it and rolled with it. And then it was other occurrences where my language helper would be telling a story or saying something, and I remember the one word he used was wasagao. Wasagam is like in a circle, and pimahao is to like fly. And so like wasaga, how he said it, and he didn't even have to explain because it just like painted this picture in my mind of going in a circle while flying, and I knew he was talking about this hawk that was soaring in the sky.
Wow.
Yeah, and so like things like that where it just eventually it all starts to like fall into place. And yeah, but it takes some commitment, definitely takes a lot of work, and but I think that's a part of the fun of it.
Yeah, that's cool, man. That's awesome. That's amazing to hear that epiphany moment, or that moment where, like you said, the light bulb went off.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah. And with you though, you did decide to learn the language on your own terms, and with what you had access to. So what was your learning method and style?
So like growing up on the res, going to school in the res school, I guess for planes, I guess, the resources were all the same, where they taught you how to write and read the Cree language through SRO. They taught you ape. They taught you nipoe. They taught you that famous little jingle like hello, hello, that one that everyone just
Every Cree person like our age knows that song.
yeah.
Yeah.
And like and so I learned that from I think kindergarten all the way to grade 12, and then even into my post-sec years when I was in university. I took Cree class. I came out of there, and like I still wasn't a speaker. My fluency was very low, and I understood how the language worked and everything, but to actually be a speaker, it was very minimal. And I kind of did my own soul searching and my own research on different methods, and then I started to find other people, other indigenous people from either across in the Americas or even in Aotearoa, who are doing like really, really cool things and producing speakers. And from there, I started to focus more on hearing the language and speaking. And I think that was the most like direct approach to being a speaker. And so I put a lot of time and energy into that. And I also acknowledge that the Western system of learning that we've been like kind of ingrained in to occupy in, or like just to exist in, of like reading and writing and memorization and all that stuff, that it was like still very present. And I kind of had to acknowledge that part of me still existed, but I also knew that I didn't want to learn in that way anymore.
This is what's unique about your narrative and your story in terms of being a language learner and picking up the language, is you use the tools that we always sort of had available to us. So how did you combat that need to use the Western writing system, or to use the standard Roman orthography, or to use that sort of like Western classroom learning? How did you go about combating that?
To combat that, what I did is like, because we're fortunate in Nêhiyawêwin to have a takupegana, like the spirit markers, the syllabics. I already had a knowledge of how that system worked, those spirit markers worked, and I retaught myself to become really proficient at that, so that if I did need to write anything down, that if I did need to write a word down or write a phrase down, or even do any kind of reading, that I made sure that it was in the syllabics. And so that way, even in reading the language, I was able to still hear the sounds, see the symbols, and have that connection as a way of kind of like rebelling against the written system.
Yeah, that's really cool, because even in that act, that's like a decolonial act to utilize our writing system and go about learning the language through our writing system, which a lot of people call for. Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah, and so now I still kind of use the writing system in terms of my own learning, but it's very minimal. A lot of it's done through audio. So I prep what I want to learn, and let's say I don't even have examples on me, but like let's say I'm out walking, and then I see something like there's ice, and I'm like, oh, I almost slipped on this ice, and I'm like, I wonder how to say that in the language. Okay, I'll write that down, and then I go to my language helper. And I'd be like, so I was walking, and then I saw this ice, and I want to learn how to say like this, like, and so I come to them prepared what I want to know, and then we have our own little method of a recording process where we kind of like go back and forth of make sure we're understanding each other and the context of what I want to say and how I want to say it.
Yeah, and what's the process of like finding a language helper, or just going about, asking them for help in this case?
So if you're going to have a language helper, it's always good to have protocol. So always have some tobacco or something. I think it's really important. It's a sacred language, spiritual language that you acknowledge that part. And I think that in turn returns back to you by them helping.
Yeah, that's really important to highlight. Like the spiritual relationship we have with our language has to be respected. So in terms of your process and your exercise of sitting down with a language helper and trying to figure out what you want to say, how do you go about like retaining that information, or how do you go about recording that information for you to utilize as a learning tool?
Once that's clear and we're both agreeing on that, so I pull out my phone on my recorder and I get them to say the phrase 3 times with a pause in between each time, and so it's slowed down enough that you can hear it each time and replay it. So then once it's saved, you let them hear it, and if they're okay with how they sound, then you have that. And I would just listen to a phrase or something for like 15 minutes. I would just put on headphones and I would just listen to it on repeat, and eventually that you hear it enough from your language helper, it just becomes a part of you. So I can remember like some of the first lessons that I've learned in that method that are forever within me now to use. And so that's like one of my methods of being able to like focus on hearing the language and speaking. But I'm also very conscious on trying to hear the language as much as possible. So I go on YouTube, or I go on the Blue Quills. I can't remember how they say it in the language, but they have a podcast as well where they've interviewed elders. NBC Radio does some interviews with elders, and they have all those online, so you can like save those and download them and even upload them onto your phone. And so like I would just play those conversations, and it's all in the language. And then even when I was sleeping, I would just turn it on repeat and just let my phone run. And even when I was sleeping, the language was playing. And that much of a commitment that I was willing to take to be able to hear the language as often as I could and limit English.
Yeah, and you even took it to the point of limiting English in your daily life, like the things we have all around us. You intentionally avoided that because you didn't want it to interfere with your learning process and thinking in the language. So tell us about that time.
So there was a time to where I even stopped reading books because I didn't want to think in that mode. And even music, I was really conscious that I stopped listening to music that had actual like English lyrics, where I just listened to music that was instrumental or had like, it was just a compilation of beats. That's how I occupied for a really long time, just to be able to hear the language as much as possible and put it into practice, where now I feel like I can make the sounds of our language a lot easier and a lot quicker than someone who's focused on a learning system that is solely based on like a resource like a book or something. But I know a lot of people don't have that access, and I know other people don't learn in that way, but I know it worked for me and it's continuing that way. So yeah, I'm going to keep in that mode.
You not only like were you actively wanting to learn to speak the language, but you were working to also write in it, and then writing in it led to you even, just thinking in it, like going about it to consciously say, I'm not going to do English today. That's cool, man. That's next level for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's a big commitment. But at the same time, it's also challenging too, because I got to try and exist in this world too. So then I have to go to work, or I have to, do all those things. And then I get pulled into a English speaking space, or just a space that we normally exist in society. And sometimes it unravels everything that I learned the day before. And then I try and go and pick up again. I'm like so frustrated because then I have to relearn it or try and rethink in that manner.
And you highlighted something interesting, a relationship you have here with your process in learning the language. You had a language teacher, a language partner. What is that, and how did that relationship work?
So my language helper, after I lost my late dad, he kind of stepped in that role as Nêhiyawêwin, and so I offered him a gift and some tobacco to be that role for me. And in doing so, he also agreed to be my language helper. So I think it's really important that if you could find a person in your community who's a fluent speaker, or just find someone who you would like to sound like. That's another one. And my language helper is he's very fluent, and I always love the way he speaks in the language and is able to, even when he tells stories, I'll be like, yeah, that's kind of the mold or the blueprint that I want my language speaking to be based upon. That's what a language helper is.
Yeah. And you also highlighted the importance of protocol. We talked about that. But in this case, your language helper is also like a kinship. It's a spiritual, cultural kinship you have with this person, which is also really cool because it did allow you and does allow you to learn your language and pick up the language. And not like in the Western teacher-mentor way, but literally in a kinship way, like a cultural, spiritual kinship way where, there's roles and responsibilities being fulfilled. And it's a spiritual language, so there's like a symbiotic relationship here, not only between yourself and your language learner, but also like the language and culture and spirituality itself.
Yeah. I think it's, you can frame it in the way of, I'm just doing some language work, or I'm learning the language. But even in just that resurgent of like cultural knowledge and things that are embedded in our way of life just get highlighted or like brought to light and are put into practice, all because I'm learning our language. And it's really cool how it's just all tied together and how they all work together. Especially when it's like when the focal point is Nêhiyawêwin. Yeah.
And I guess that's something that some people tend to misunderstand about learning the language, which is a question I had for you, is that it's also often just like isolated and taught just as learning the language. But like you said, it's so much more to that.
Yeah, I love the way that there's this connection to all things. I think I touched on it earlier, where when you speak, like I was having a conversation with a friend of mine, one of my mentors as well, one of my many mentors, and we were talking about, I think we were talking about the word muna one, where it's like it looks good, and then we started talking about glasses. I can't even. My brain's hurting. It's trying to think in Cree. We were using the term for glasses, and then that reminded me of a word I heard my dad use in reference to sunglasses. He said the word kimuta paganan, which is like secret eye looking glasses or something. Yeah. It's like, and I really like that term. But even by me saying kimuta paganan, it brings me back to that memory that he spoke that word, and that connects us. The language connects us. Mm-hmm. Oh, just thinking about that I'm connected to my late dad by a word that he spoke years ago, but yet we're still connected right now.
Yeah.
And just imagine if you tie that into prayer and you say the same things that our ancestors have said throughout time, and you're connected. I believe the language is like timeless. Really cool. It's like really like powerful stuff. Kind of gives me the goosebumps.
And I'm really glad we're having this conversation, because this is what's often overlooked, right? Is that in the 9 to 3 o'clock system, it's hard because a lot of young people just go to school trying to survive and get through. There's a lot of shame in school because, they may not be performing well enough. Stuff may be going on at home. So like the headspace to be able to make those big jumps you're talking about between English and Cree isn't really there because of so much going on. Even in my experience of how academics or people talk about language, they're not talking about it in this way. So that this is something I really wanted to highlight, especially for young people. And also like even doing the work I do, I'm fluent in English. Like I hate to say it, right? Because not only am I could talk in English, but I'm an academic. So I know a lot of like political theory and stuff. And I just did a podcast with Jason Mercury where he said, communism's that's not our word, or even, capitalism, that's not our word. Utilitarianism, that's not our word. We don't have those words per se in our language. And I've been, ever since I did this podcast, it's like I've been hating the English language because I'm overthinking how I'm talking. And I'm seeing that gap in language tied to my emotions. Like I know that our language is spiritual. I know it connects me to my ancestors, but there's almost like it's like a shadow there I have to go put light to see what my issues are and what's limiting me from learning. But I notice English isn't the language I want to speak. Like I'm conscious of that. So that's my question for you. What do you notice about the English language that is just weird or problematic, like in terms of style and flow and discussion?
I don't know. I feel like it's like there's so much hidden meaning or like different meanings to a single word that could be misconstrued, or it could be almost like manipulated to harm.
Mm-hmm.
It's like same as me. Like the day that, well, I have this vision of when I become a fully fluent speaker, and I don't want to ever revert back to speaking English, and then I'm never going to compromise myself again. And if people want to understand me, they can hire a translator and understand me that way. But that's for the Otenigan in the future. But like for the English language, the same. It's like I don't like speaking it. It's like it makes me angry. It's like I don't respect the language. I don't respect it at all. And I think when it comes to speaking our language and trying to express what we're saying and translate it into English, it really gets watered down. And I like using that word. It compromises our expression of our own worldview, how we see it.
And I'm really glad you said that, because that's been even my struggle, even with my PhD writing. I'm a slow writer right now because I know I'm overthinking words, but I'm also overthinking words because I know like some rinky-dink academic from somewhere else is gonna pinpoint that one word I use and deconstruct it. And like that's the problem with the English language, like you said, is that, you know, there's no feeling in the language. And it's all like, it all has to be, it's almost like a surface level language where, like, for me to speak about governance, I have to explain it in English for someone to understand it. But, you know, like my late father, when we had conversations about governance, he just summed it up with like, mama way atamasoin. And it's like people coming together to make a decision. Yeah. and just that one word, like it just basically wrote my undergrad senior project paper for me, because I just emphasized what that word said our means in Cree, right?
Yeah.
And that's my issue with English right now, is like being 100% upfront, is that I have a really hard time writing it because I know settlers are going to deconstruct it and settlers are going to find issues with the work that we do when we write in English. And not even like settlers, but even our own people, you know, people who aren't fluent in our language, or people who are living outside our communities who don't really understand the dynamics of what's taking place, tend to use English in a way where it causes harm, or it limits mobility, it limits our potential to do what we need to do, and ultimately use the English language to minimize and oppress our own people who aren't fluent in English, or who don't understand, you know, those big legal or educational or academic concepts. But you said it yourself, where it's like, I'm striving for a day where all I want to use is Cree, and they could hire a translator if they want to understand me.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the ultimate decolonial act, right?
Yeah.
And then so you'll just be ordering your Tim Hortons in Cree all the time. And
well, the good thing about Cree is like it's good speakers or good storytellers are really good at like their gestures, and so
yeah,
you could, someone who doesn't understand, you could just watch the gestures and be like, oh, they're talking about this, and so I'm sure people would figure it out. We had to.
Yeah, and like that was my experience growing up, is I had to be really mindful of even gestures and things like that. And my Cree's like, I think the issue with my language, I started to have a problem when I realized I could understand more Spanish than I can Cree. And I was like, oh man, you know, I'm learning another colonial tongue here. And then and now, you know, my partner, she's Comanche, right? She's Comanche, and she knows some Spanish too. So now, I don't want to say I dug myself in a hole, but now we're like in a trilingual household where there's English, Cree, Comanche, and now even Spanish to some extent that we're all trying to actively learn and engage in. And especially with the daughter now, we're really mindful of the language use. And my partner knowing some Spanish, she's far more fluent than me. Our daughter's picking up on that too. So it's like I'm starting to have really mindful conversations about this and things like that.
Yeah.
But you're right to say too that like it's a descriptive language where we talk with our hands. And you were here at the Plains Indian Sign Language workshop we had on Palmaker. So that's sort of like our middle ground right now is we're learning Plains Indian Sign Language because it allows us to learn the language too.
Yeah, that was a neat experience. I could really see the positive impact that would have if we were able to introduce that to children who are under the age of 5, and that'd be, I don't know, so many little ideas came to mind when I was there and participating. It was a really good experience.
Dr. Manny Realbird, his name is, I think. Yeah, he does that. That was his whole, work and yeah, Plains Indian Sign Language, for our listeners who don't know, it's the Plains Indian way of communicating through your hand gestures, and it was universal. Like some signs changed in different regions, but for the most part it was universal. So the Plains Indian Sign Language my partner knows, signs she knew and the signs we knew up here were the same. So that sort of just speaks to how another form of language, I guess, that we have that is also a learning tool, because that is also how I'm learning some action words in Cree.
Yeah.
And then you also talked about how in the language too, these words, they're not just words, they're also concepts. They're also like philosophies tied to them, and it's like it's literally a worldview. And my adopted uncle Jerry Saddleback, he has a lot of knowledge around the creation story, fluent in the language and things like that. And when I started to shoot bow and started to pick up the bow and do that practice, I had to go about finding some information around the cosmology and things like that. And he was one of the guys I talked to over the phone, and he was excited and encouraged me to keep doing what I'm doing with that. But he just launched a video for, I think, Edmonton Public Libraries, where he's unpacking some of the words we have for the bow achapi.
Oh, yeah.
And he deconstructed the word achapi. Like achak means spirit and bimatsoen means life. So it's like spirit and life tied to that tool.
Yeah.
So it's like it's a whole concept, and it's a whole philosophy tied to that. And I'm only sharing it because he publicly shared it too. And when I seen him publicly share it, I was like, oh man, I went through so much to like uncover this concept or this things like that. And to pick up a bow and figure out how to make it. And then my uncle Jerry Saddleback goes and makes a YouTube video for everybody to see, which is good too, which is good.
Yeah.
Which is good that, now people hear this, and he talks about our 4 types of bow we use and things like that. And it's great to see, but I just saw the humor in it as, a time in my life where I was so eager on making a bow and, even like hurting and cutting my hands and then, yeah, he shared that information out there. But that's just an example.
I remember sitting when I went over and visit with you guys there. That was a while ago, but and you're showing me the bows that you have, and then I was talking about the word like for an arrowhead is atos, and then how today the word for work is atos scale. Where I was like, I wonder if the original, I don't know, the way that it works in my mind is like this missionary was kind of like walking all in community and was asking what different things were, and then he saw this person making an arrow and asked him, what's this guy doing? And he's like, oh, what the scale? Like he's making an arrow, and they're like, oh, that means work. And then we just adopted it ever since.
It's possible, man. It makes sense. I remember us talking about that.
I don't know.
but that's true. Like that's an example of just like how these words have bigger meanings and they're tied to so much more. And and I guess that's an example. But also, what do you notice about the Cree language, like the styles and the flow and the discussion?
I think early on in the learning, people just hear the sounds and you're like, holy man, that word has like a million sounds, and how am I supposed to make my mouth make those sounds? But once you, like me, I really focused on the star chart using Jacapeg, and I think I shared a couple like videos on Facebook and YouTube on just the different sounds that the markers make, and I really put an emphasis on knowing the sounds and being proficient at that, so that when it came to repeating words or hearing words, I'd be able to say them because I'm already, the spirit markers have helped me make the proper sounds that the language makes. And so when I hear the language now, or even when I'm like saying something in the language, instead of it being very like me only hearing the short little consonants or whatever, however we want to describe that, instead of it being choppy, you hear someone speak and it's almost like a wave. I don't know. It's like there's this rhythm to it. You'll eventually get to this place where you jump on that rhythm, and and it's really fun because then you're like, oh man, I'm like on the same rhythm this person's talking. And I think another example I remember, I was learning what a squirrel. Yeah. I didn't know what the word for it was, and then my language helper told me it was iniquitas. I was like, holy man. I was like, even that, I was like, iniquitas. And then I kept messing up. And then I was like, well, how do you pluralize that? And then he said the word, and I kept fumbling over and over and over because all you're adding is suck at the end. And then I was like, iniquitas suck. But I wasn't saying it right. I can't even say it the way that I was originally saying it, but now it's just like or it's like this flow to it. Yeah. And same with words like where two points intersect, like menikan, a fence, guasakao, which is the bush, kanakskamumakake is where they meet, where they intersect. So it's like very specific. It tells you in your mind that this fence and where this bush, there's like this place where they meet. That's the place I'm talking about. It's really neat, like how once you get comfortable in making the sound, you get confident in your speaking, you're just able to like jump on that wavelength and be like, I don't know, instead of it feeling rigid and stuff, you just start feeling like it flows like water or flows like wind or something.
Yeah. And what is one thing that happened as a result of learning Cree that you didn't expect?
Oh man, that's a big question. I think one was when asking for help, I guess spiritually, being able to say it in the language and like feel like that plead is coming from the center of me, and just like it's full and it's all of me. It's all of everyone who has ever said that word. And like it could be the word like wichin, like help me. And you're just pleading to our ancestors or Semanto or I don't know, whoever. And you say that, and it just like, I don't know, just this feeling of it being authentic and it being all of me. And it's like, that's something I never expected to feel as a learner because I wasn't aware that was present.
Wow. Yeah, that's deep stuff for sure. And it's really good to position that, even just saying that word, reaching in, like asking for help.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or giving thanks, or like, I don't know, any little one of those. Yeah, it's just, that's one thing that has happened as a result. But if we're talking more like in physical space, I think opportunities. You don't know how, like, the opportunities to be able to like share stories or share experiences, something that I never thought would be like this. For example, I didn't ever intend for this to happen, but it's something that I'm thankful for and I'm grateful for, and that it just kind of allows us to help each other people who are I guess maybe in the same boat or wanting to get on this journey as well. And it's just even right there in itself that in terms of language learning, it's like it's not intended to be learned alone. We are never siloed people. It's always together. And so I think like even in this manner, that word mamu wichihtuin is like helping one another together. It just like reinforces that aspect of who we are as a people.
And that's why I wanted to highlight you, is because you're the guy that's doing it and doing that work on the fly. And it's amazing to see and just see your development in the time we've known each other. And and that's something I want to do. Like seeing you now do that, it's like it's definitely opening my mind and my consciousness to these conversations that we're having here. And I'm hoping it does for our listeners, especially the young ones, like the younger generation who wants to learn their language too. Because I feel the conversations we're having here, I never had with anybody else yet. Just because there's often an age dynamic. There's often even a generational dynamic where, you know, some older people are residential school survivors, or some people are academics, like a top-down type structure. But to have a conversation with another, you know, we're still young, another young guy. Yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah, I was like, thinking to myself, I think on my 29th birthday, I was like, oh man, I'm 29 years old, but people still call me a young person, but I'm not really considered a young person anymore. And, but then I was like making this little vow to myself that I was like, by the time I'm like 35, I want to be like this fluent speaker. I want to be fluent. And then now I'm like 31, and I'm just like, oh man, you better continue getting there because it's creeping up.
Yeah, and that's a good goal to have. Good goal to have for sure.
Yeah. Because it's I don't know, because there was a time where I was as a language learner, it's such a vulnerable space to be in. Like, oh man, like there's still times where I'm vulnerable. I'm still like shy to speak and like, or shy to ask for help, or it's such a vulnerable space, and I don't think that ever goes away. I just think you get comfortable with it, and you just learn to persevere.
So yeah, you talked about how at 29 you had this goal, but even like for your younger self, if you could go back in time and talk to yourself before starting this whole process, what would you tell yourself?
I would, if I could go back and talk to myself, I would take something back with me from this future sense of me, so that they would know it's me, that they know it's real, and I would plead to them to see how precious time is. How precious time is of like the people that you have in your life that are really valuable, to not take them for granted, especially the ones who are fluent, and to be brave first, because this is really vulnerable work. You're constantly putting yourself in a vulnerable space, and it's scary, and so to be able to prepare myself early on to get comfortable with that would have speeded up the process. Yeah, I think that'd be one.
And what about to young people? What would you tell young people who are going to go on this journey of reclaiming their language?
For young people who are like wanting to learn, and this is like, I don't want to give this like cookie cutter answer, or this like one solution fits all kind of thing that's going to answer all this, and once you learn this, you're going to be a fluent speaker. It's like, probably the one thing is that my role is like, I don't want people to be like me or speak like me. It's like, but what I want is like, I want to be able to create safe spaces for that vulnerability, so that, because everyone's going to have to go through it. They're going to have to go and ask for help. They're going to have to want it. They're going to have to do that for themselves. But I want to be able to create a space that I wish I had when I was early on. It's like being safe to speak amongst peers, being safe to ask questions that you may feel you don't know the answer to, or like that you need support on. And it's like, that's what I want in terms of that. Because like, yeah, the vulnerability piece is always going to be there. It's just my job to make sure that transition, or that you get really comfortable in the uncomfortableness.
Yeah. Dang. Yeah. Getting really comfortable in the uncomfortableness. Yeah.
Yeah. Take the leap.
Yeah, take the leap for sure. I find that like in my field of work now, that I'm starting to realize that sometimes English conversations are just futile because someone's always going to critique what you're saying. And that annoys me. But then at the same time, we have the very real like colonial dynamic of where it's really hard to learn our language. And a lot of people spent a lot of time, learning English, or just starting to get to like the era of where we could start to say that we are almost as good as settlers. And I don't like that. Like, I think even for me, on a certain extent, it comes up for me on some level of colonization. But, and that's where my strength's coming from. So it's not a matter of like minimizing myself. It's a matter of embracing who I truly am, I feel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's also really important to highlight that as a language learner, you, first and foremost, it has to be like, you have to be doing it for yourself. I was getting a firm footing in my language learning, and I put on this extra pressure on myself that I needed to help others and help them with their language journey. But I know a lot of people aren't there. A lot of people are just freaking trying to survive, man. And language learning is a tough task, even for someone who's privileged enough to be in the position that I'm in.
Yeah, everything you're saying is on point. Like, I really like what you're saying, because there's so much life in what you're saying. And I think people need to hear it from this perspective, because sometimes there's like shame, right? There's shame with, like you say, not having enough time, just trying to survive. I'll learn it later, and things like that. Because I feel like a lot of people tend to have the goal of wanting to learn their language in the back of their mind, but it's not, like, sometimes it's not feasible with colonialism and the 9 to 5 and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, like the idea, they love the idea of them wanting to learn the language, but when in actuality the realness of life gets in the way, and it really can bombard someone to even think that it's even possible. And that's hard for me, because like I'm doing it, like I'm trying to learn actively, but even those thoughts creep into me. So that's like really like a realistic struggle that even those of us who are further along in learning are going through, is that piece of like that discouragement almost. And then it really weighed heavy on me, feeling like I was failing. And so I think the key point is to make sure that you're in it for yourself, that you're focusing on your journey, and then just let everything kind of come together. And those who want to be there will make that decision for themselves, and then they'll either reach out or they'll see what you're doing and will want the same for themselves. And then if you think about it in a very spiritual context, is like the work that I'm doing is like, I envision that the person or these people who are going to find this, I don't know, solution, I guess, in the sense, that they're somewhere in the future. And if I could reach one of them or help spark something inside someone who leads to those people who help make the process and revive it into the manner that we need it to be, then I feel like I fulfilled what I was here to do.
Yeah, and I guess that even ties into the spirituality of the language, is that it's a way where we help one another, where we encourage one another, and it's present and everyone who is connected to it.
I feel the language just really keeps you in that spiritual space, even though like our language is humorous, it's funny, it's like, it's so full, but it's so grounded in the spiritual aspect of Nêhiyaw, as a Nêhiyaw. Like even in that word, like you just, like the terminology that I've heard of it, it's like the morphology of that word is from 2 words, like Nêhiyawêwin, and then Weo is body, so 4-bodied, and then it speaks to like that being, those 4 bodies of a person that make a human being: mental, emotional, physical, spiritual, like Nêhiyawêwin. Yeah, I don't know, it's like really powerful stuff.
Yeah, you're giving us a lot to think about and unpack here, man, because this is the type of conversations I feel people need to have when they're talking about language, and sometimes we don't get access to it, and sometimes language conversations are too structural and too professional. Sometimes, especially in some circles, our language community circles. And again, like a lot of shame people have around it. And it's really cool you're talking about how this is something that's always going to be here, where it's going to be uncomfortable, always. So you got to get used to the discomfort of it and move forward and be brave in that way. So what are some helpful phrases for young people who want to learn the language that they could ask in Cree?
The first one I feel is the most important is Moininstohten.
Moininstohten.
Or I guess that's shortened. You could say Moininstohten, but a lot of fluent speakers just say Moininstohten, which means I don't understand. Yeah, that is one big one that it's okay to say. It's okay to say "moinstoten," and it's very humbling because it puts you in your place like that. Yeah, I don't know, and you're showing that vulnerability, and your language helper, the loving, supportive holder of our language, will support you. So that's a big one. Another one is "kihtuametue," which is say it again.
Kituametwe.
Kihtuametue. And so if you learn a phrase or you learn a word and they say it, and maybe they say it too fast because they're just speaking their language, and you need them to repeat it. Kihtuametue. Say it again.
Kituametwe.
Yeah. Or some people say asamina.
Asamina.
Asamina. And again, kind of, so usually my language helper says that term a lot when after I say a word or a phrase, and he wants to encourage me to keep saying it till I get it so I can say it comfortably and easily. He just says asamina, asamina, and I just keep repeating the word. Another one I feel is really helpful is when I first came onto the podcast, I said "kitatamskatin," which is it's like I greet you, and then that is one really key part of our being is greeting each other, and so I think that's one to learn. "Kitatamskatin."
Kitatamskatin.
Yeah. And then if you want to pluralize it, like if you're speaking to a group, it "kitatamskatin now." Yeah, "kitatamskatin now."
Kitatamskatin. Wow. And how would you say, like, for a language learner who's just starting out, how would you say, how do you say this? Or something like that.
Yeah, I usually would say like "tansise e tuet." Like I ask it like a question, like "tansise e tuet." I don't know, water bottle. So "tansise e tuet," and then whatever you want them to say. So you could ask your fluent speaker "tansise e tuet water bottle," and they'll see it and they'll be like, "Oh, nipi mutea pisk." I don't know, something like that. I think those are like the helpful ones. And
yeah, man, that's good. That's good. Little survival guide.
Yeah. If we can get a podcast going, it'll just make that more readily available.
Yeah, bro. Well, yeah, you definitely need to start podcasting because there's lots of information you're sharing with us, and you're knowledgeable. And I know you said you didn't intentionally, like, it wasn't necessarily a plan to it was unexpected to be in a position where you're teaching and helping people learn. But I mean, you're there, and it's really cool to see you on this path because you're a positive, healthy role model. You're a healthy male figure that young people need to see and ideally look up to, and you're doing the work that needs to be done to help our people.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. It's still a work in progress. I'm even trying to humble myself in that term you just said, because mental health is still an important piece to, even as a language learner, because I guess to tie things off, there was a point where I was really high in my learning and really confident, and it took the words of one person to really deflate, and it really kind of took me on a spiral, and my mental health took a big hit, and it took me a long time to pull myself out. And so now that I put work into it, and I'm continuing to work on my mental health and pull myself into the light again, to get to this version of myself that I feel is worthy to be in this space and trying to lead these kind of conversations. And so I think that's another thing for language learners is make sure to take care of yourself mental health wise, because it'll be challenged in this journey.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you got a comeback game, bro. You're coming back strong, and we definitely need to help you get a podcast off the ground.
Yeah, we'll try. We'll see.
Yeah, and then let us know if you need anything, because we'll gladly help you out and do what we can.
Sounds good.
Right on, man. Anything else you want to say? Any shout-outs you want to give?
I'll share a story. If you want to add it in there, you can. When I was in the height of my language learning journey, I made the decision that I wanted to go to Aotearoa and learn from a people who are doing some really cool things in their own reo. And So I went there, and the story behind how I connected with this family is profound, and I kind of think it just ties into the power of the language. It connects us spiritually. But I went, and they took us to this place along the coast, and we went to the language school that this family sent their children, and their children are adults now. I was sitting there around the table. It was myself, the Jeffreys, that family, the two elders who ran the school for like 30 years, my ex-partner at the time, and her sister, and they're both French speaking, and then so the Jeffreys and all the other ones were speaking in Te Reo Maori, and so I was like sitting there, and they were all just speaking in Te Reo Maori, and we were like just sitting there listening. And there was this little baby for one of the granddaughters of the two elders, was sitting there as well, joining in the conversation. And they had a little baby, like a 2-year-old or something, and they're all speaking in Te Reo, and they didn't bother translating to us. They're just being Maori. And it was really emotional for me because I was the only one sitting around that table who had never witnessed that, who had never seen so many different generations be able to converse with each other in their language. Like even my ex-partner and her sister, their family is they're Quebecois, and so they do that all the time. And so like even I don't think they could empathize with that. And it was just a really powerful moment for me, seeing that if you invest in the importance of language, it's just that it's possible. I just still think about that. And I take him as a brother, him and his partner, they just had a little one, and he sent me a video of him speaking in Te Reo to him. And I was like, wow, it's powerful stuff, man. And just got emotional seeing that. And I don't know, the power of language, man, it's just pretty great. And I think I wanted to tie everything off with that.
Yeah, that's a great story. And it's so important for our young people to travel and see, even connect with other Indigenous people. Because even for me, like it's a very similar circumstance where, I was in other parts of the world connecting with Indigenous people. And even though we didn't speak the same language, you could pick up on the sacredness of the relationship and dynamic they have with their family, their language, their way of life. And it's almost as if like you meet on that level. You connect on that level. And then even just like being, I don't even want to say, well, like when I was first traveling, my late father always said that, there's always going to be Indigenous people in an area that are connected to the land and to the place. And you got to be respectful of that when you're there. Like Asiinu, like human beings are over there too. You know what I mean? Like there's a connection they have to that space. Yeah. And so every time I traveled, that's the place I traveled from. And connecting to those people is really vital, and it opens doors. And it's really cool to hear that story and that connection and kinship you built with Aotearoa in that area.
Just amazing how far this language learning kind of takes you. Even yeah. Because I was that connection that I made there was an art piece that I did that was tied to language. It's everything was like the things that have kind of unfolded in my life have been like a direct result of because language was the focal point. I don't know. It's really cool. I don't know how to explain it. Just magic.
Yeah.
It's the force.
It is. I mean, that's the best. That's the only way to describe it, right? It's like it's a force. There's a pull. There's a pull that takes you places. And once you tie into that consciousness and to that intention of wanting to learn or experience something, it does pull you. And there is a spiritual relationship to learning and education from our perspective in that way. Because even for me, I never expected to go to Santa Fe, New Mexico, or University of Hawaii, Manoa, and all these places. It's like almost sometimes didn't even have a choice. Just you got to go and do it, But learn from those experiences.
Yeah.
It's really cool to hear that.
Yeah, I think I shared enough.
Right, bro. Well, thanks for your time. I appreciate it. You gave us a lot to think about, and I'm really glad that you're doing the work you're doing. And yeah, we got to get you a podcast off the ground.
No, I thank you for having me, man. It's like an honor to be able to share what I've learned and freely try and help other people as as you are trying to do. Yeah, man. So thanks again. Kinanaskum tin. Next episode.